Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 4K Speaker Series with John Kalbfleisch, who is going to present Lovers and Rebels in Old Canada. John is the author of A Stain Upon the Land and its new sequel, The 37, which he will be presenting today. So welcome, John, and I will give it over to you.
Well, thank you, Chloe, for those kind words and for the opportunity to introduce my new book. It's titled The 37 and is centered on the rebellion of 1837 in Lower Canada, today's Quebec. Let me get right to it. The rebellion was one of the most important building blocks leading to the Canada that we know today, for it was that violent upheaval, and a smaller one in Ontario the same year, that led directly to the establishment of responsible government in this country. Government that depends on, that is, government that's responsible to the will of the elected representatives of the people. Now, at the time of the rebellion, it's true, there was an elected assembly in Lower Canada. There had been one for nearly half a century. However, its legislation could and sometimes was vetoed by the governor, and this man was appointed by Britain's colonial department in far-off London. If this assembly could be called responsible, it was effectively responsible only to the whims of the governor and his cabal of advisors. Now, the rebellion in the autumn and early winter of 1837 was centered mainly in the Richelieu Valley, east of Montreal, in and around the village of Saint-Eustache, northwest of Montreal, and in Montreal itself. The map you see here was drawn especially for my book. There was a savage riot lasting most of the day in Montreal. There were protest meetings in Montreal and the surrounding countryside, including one where some 5,000 people gathered in a muddy field in the Richelieu Valley. And there were three battles at Saint-Denis and Saint-Charles in the Richelieu Valley, and at Saint-Eustache. Against the odds, the Patriots, that is, the rebels, defeated Colonel Charles Gore and his British regulars in the first of these fights late in November at Saint-Denis, but they were annihilated 2 days later at Saint-Charles and in mid-December at Saint-Eustache. In these battles, a few British soldiers died, yes, but so did many, many hundreds of woefully underarmed rebels, shot, eviscerated by sword or bayonet, burned to death, struck by cannonballs, drowned, whatever. The rebellion failed in that the rebels were crushed and the existing system of government remained intact. But the rebellion succeeded in that the famous report of Lord Durham, a couple of years later, strongly recommended that responsible government be granted. And so it duly came to pass in Nova Scotia in 1848, and shortly after in the so-called province of Canada, today's Ontario and Quebec. Now, I suspect that many of you are starting to roll your eyes. Let me reassure you that the 37 is not a boring political science tract, but a tale of high drama. There are the desperate battles that I mentioned a moment ago. There are the resulting devastated villages and countryside. There is that riot in Montreal centered on Place d'Armes. There is a child abuser who gets exactly what he deserves, and a duel at dawn on Mount Royal. There is the bitterness of exile, as well as a number of judicial murders, otherwise known as hangings. And while the tale is certainly not a bodice ripper, it does have, how shall I put it, more than a couple of frisky bits. Now, on the subject of friskiness, the central characters of the novel are Dorothy Russell, a Scottish-born schoolteacher who is a creature of my imagination, and George-Étienne Cartier, who, like most people in the book, most certainly is not. Dorothy dominates my previous novel, A Stain Upon the Land, which focuses on a notorious murder that it actually occurred in Montreal 10 years before, in 1827. No one was ever punished for that crime, but that hasn't prevented a stain upon the land from pointing the finger at who done it. Now, in the 37, Dorothy meets Cartier, a radical lawyer several years her junior. They draw closer, but so does the armed rebellion of Cartier and his fellow patriot against the might of the British Crown. Cartier fights in the rebellion. He is prominent at the Battle of Saint-Denis. We know that. What we don't know is how Cartier gradually rejects violence and, in the years that follow, comes to accept the wisdom of patient political evolution. This photograph, taken some 25 years after the rebellion, shows him not as a patriot, but as the established politician he became. Indeed, by 1867, he and Sir John A. Macdonald were chief among the fathers of Confederation. But we don't know how this profound change in Cartier came about, because little relevant documentation has survived from that day to this. And that is where my novel, The 37, steps in. It's the privilege of someone writing historical fiction to fill in the blanks, to invent people, conversation, events, where the absence of pertinent records allows him to do so. And so, do the charms of the beautiful and witty Dorothy Russell account for the change in George-Étienne Cartier? Well, that is for you, the reader, to discover. Now, I went to high school in Ontario in British Columbia. I hope I'm not being unfair to my teachers, rest their souls, but the impression left with me by the history we were taught is that the Lower Canada rebels were ill-mannered French-speaking louts who had some nerve in questioning their place. More succinctly, how dare they? All right, this was high school in English Canada in the late 1950s, but you get the idea. But the more I have read about the rebellion, the more I have come to see it as a considerably more admirable venture. This is something I have tried to convey in the 37. The rebellion has come to mean different things to different people over the nearly 2 centuries since. In the 37, the rebellion was not simply a French versus English thing, the way it so often seems to be cast nowadays, or even a proto-independence movement. For me, it was primarily about what I have people like Cartier expressing. Canadians, regardless of language, fighting against established privilege and for some form of responsible government. Furthermore, while Francophones were certainly in the majority among the rebels, some Anglophones not only fought, but also undeniably were prominent among the rebellion's leadership. A doctor named Wilfred Nelson was the military leader at Saint-Denis, and his younger brother, Robert, also a doctor, mounted a dismal follow-up rising a year later. Thomas Storrow Brown, a journalist and one-time hardware merchant, led the Patriot at Saint-Charles. Edmund Bailey O'Callaghan was editor of one of the most vigorous newspapers supporting the Patriot, The Vindicator. That English language newspaper, incidentally, was utterly destroyed by an Anglo mob during the Montreal riot I mentioned earlier, never to publish again. A man who played an oddly significant part in the rebellion, and does so in the 37, is a popular, cheerful, even feckless lieutenant in the 32nd Regiment of Foot named Jack Weir. Through two of his own mistakes, he is captured by the Patriot on the eve of Saint-Denis. And the following day, with the battle about to break out there, he is sent under armed guard south, out of the village. Now, as with any incident of warfare, large or small, let no one think for an instant that there was anything tidy or gentlemanly or noble or chivalrous about the Battle of Saint-Denis, or, least of all, what actually befell the young Jack Weir. Here is how I describe his fate in the book. Shortly after his awkward encounter with Wilfred Nelson, Weir had been hustled onto a wagon that would take him under guard up the river to Saint-Charles. Its driver, Francois Mignot, bound Weir's hands, keeping a tag end of the strap in his own. A couple of other men formed up beside the wagon. Their leader, Francois Jalbert, a farmer in his 60s, was mounted and carried an unsheathed sword on his shoulder. They set off. As they got to Saint-Denis' southern edge, shots could suddenly be heard from somewhere behind them. No one, neither Weir nor any of his guards, could doubt what it meant, and the young officer decided he'd never have a better chance. It was his last mistake. Weir leapt from the wagon, but he'd forgotten the strap that Mignot held. It jerked him back against the wagon, where one of the guards, in a sudden rage, stabbed at his neck with a rusted bayonet. Bleeding, Weir fell to the ground and desperately crawled beneath the wagon. The stabbing continued, and the horses, in a panic, started off, dragging the young man along. Blood spread from new wounds to his back and groin. 3 severed fingers lay in the mud. In the dreadful confusion, several villagers appeared from their houses and mobbed in, beating and stabbing at the defenseless man. Finally, someone drew a pistol and pulled the trigger to end the butchery. It misfired once, then a second time. At last, it was left to Jalbert's sword. Jalbert duly set off to find Nelson, his men and the villagers trotting behind. He arrived at the Saint-Germain house where, not far off, they could see the British soldiers wrestling their field gun into position. Nelson was dumbfounded by Jalbert's news. "You damned fool, you damned old fool," he swore. "You don't know what you've done." Now, Wilfred Nelson was an honorable man. He was furious, and it's recorded that those were his actual words, his actual reaction. We will see presently the consequences of Weir's dreadful murder. The Patriots defeated the British that day, it's true, but they were crushed 2 days later at Saint-Charles, effectively ending resistance in the Richelieu Valley. But there would be one last battle, as I noted above, and it came in the middle of December in the village of Saint-Eustache. Here, several hundred patriots under a local doctor, Jean-Olivier Chénier, were dug in. But this time, unlike what had happened at Saint-Denis, the British soldiers would arrive in far greater numbers and be far better prepared. In the passage that follows, we have Edouard Huot, an important character in both A Stain Upon the Land and the 37. He is a fatalistic man, depressed, filled with self-loathing, though you'll need to read the book to understand why. A lieutenant named Francis Griffin, an old friend of Weir, also has a part in what follows. Here goes. It was a long column. As many as 1,500 men were closing in, from Jack Weir's regiment, the 32nd, and from the 83rd, and from the ferocious Royal Scots. There was a cavalry brigade. There was artillery. They moved slowly, deliberately along the road, and they were all the more ominous for their measured pace. The patriots out on the ice scurried back, joining their companions barricaded in the church, the convent next door, the presbytery, and a few houses nearby. But the soldiers far outnumbered them. Indeed, many would-be defenders had already fled. Only a couple of hundred remained, with Chénier working hard to bolster their spirits, and among them was a man who'd volunteered the night before. "I have nothing to live for," Edouard Huot mumbled. "Perhaps there's something I can die for." Some of the men in the church had no muskets, Eddie among them, and the man beside him complained to Chénier. "Rest assured," he replied, "some of us will die, and you can take their weapons." In Chegnier's calm, icy determination, there was something oddly reassuring. The men around him erupted in cheers, and Eddie was one of the loudest. The British six-pounders and howitzers opened up soon after and continued for hours. Resistance in the outlying buildings was overwhelmed, but the church held out, its thick walls unbreached. Finally, as nightfall approached, General Colborne ordered a final assault. A detachment of the Royal Scots burst into the church through a rear door. Patriots in the galleries above fired down. Eddie was among them, for just as Chenier had promised, he now had a musket. The soldiers started a fire by the altar. It quickly caught, and as the smoke began to rise, Chenier gathered his men around him. Coughing, gagging, they staggered to the windows and began to jump. A bit of snow on the ground cushioned the fall of a few of them, but soldiers were also waiting outside, among them the 32nd, and from one man to the next the cry was heard, "Remember Jack Weir!" Even to many who were surrendering, no mercy was shown, no quarter given. Somehow Eddie was able to leap to the ground unhurt. There was a momentary gap in the line of soldiers, and in the flickering light he was able to dash through it, just as Lieutenant Francis Griffin glanced his way. With a shout, Griffin pulled the soldier next to him by the shoulder, and they set off in pursuit. Eddie had gone 20 yards, perhaps a little more, when he tripped over a tree stump. He picked himself up, but the sudden pain in his ankle told him it was over at last. He turned toward his pursuers, a ghost of a smile on his face, and held out his hands in what might have been longing? The soldier saw nothing of this. He kept coming and ran Eddie through with his bayonet. As he fell, Griffin caught him with his sword, slashing downwards across his neck. Just then, the roof of the burning church fell through, sending a cloud of sparks towering into the chill night air. Without a word, Griffin and the soldier turned and hurried back. Now that battle, the Battle of Saint-Eustache, is depicted on the book's cover. The image is taken from a larger painting by a British officer who actually was there leading his detachment of men. The painting is now at the McCord Stewart Museum in downtown Montreal. It shows the disciplined ranks of British soldiers, the more ragged patriot, the flames engulfing the buildings behind, and if you look closely, you can see a few desperate defenders jumping from the upper windows of the church. Also, if you go to Saint-Eustache today, you can still see scars in the facade of the building where cannonballs struck some 187 years ago. But lest you think there's little but blood, gore, and politics in the book, let me present at last a gentler passage. It's from a month or so after the fighting. Hundreds of patriots have been arrested and are clapped up in the Montreal jail. Others, especially among the leadership, have fled into exile in New York State and Vermont. But George-Étienne Cartier has elected to stay put. After Saint-Denis, he and his cousin Henri are hiding in the remote farmhouse of an old family friend, Antoine Larose. Hitherto, Georges and Dorothy have been tiptoeing hesitantly toward falling in love. So now, lonely and a little bored, Georges asks his brother Damien, also a Montreal lawyer, to see if Dorothy will make a secret visit from the city, even if just for a day or two. With Damien's help, she arrives at the Larose farm, and if there was any ice to be broken, it was gone in an instant. Now, in fact, Georges and Henri were accommodated in Larose's bunkhouse, a long stone's throw away, but Dorothy was given a bed in the farmhouse itself. That evening at the long farmhouse table, something like the good times of old began to roll. There's a hearty meal, there's Larose's formidable spruce beer, and Georges, ever the outgoing showman, sings several songs. Henri tells a story about Tijan, the good-natured farm boy, and how the sheep he was chasing turned out to be a cantankerous billy goat. Now, back to the book. Georges was sitting beside Dorothy, and before long, she was aware that his hand beneath the table was brushing hers. Later, clearing plates in the small kitchen, Dorothy and Georges found themselves alone, and this time it was not a quick kiss to the cheeks, but a proper kiss. When they returned, a little flushed, to the main room, both Damien and Henri managed to avoid any teasing comments, the general good cheer of the evening being too precious and perhaps too fragile to risk anything that might deflate it. It had been a long day, and the next one would be longer still. Damien had to return the sleigh to the livery stable in Saint-Jean before the afternoon stage left for Montreal, so they'd have to get up early. Henri stood up to look for his coat, and Georges reluctantly followed. Dorothy came to him as they stepped outside, Henri having the good sense to start walking on his own toward the bunkhouse. There was no moon. The air was quite cold, and no breeze disturbed the trees to the rear of the house. Look, said Georges, it's l'aurore boreale. What is it you say, the northern lights? And listen, hush, there, can you hear it, that cracking noise? Pop, pop, listen. Neither spoke, and so it was. The muted, distant popping continued for a few minutes before fading, but not the shimmering colors in the night sky, red and yellow and green. Georges said he'd once talked to a Cree from the far north of the colony, who said that among his people, the lights were the spirits of relatives who'd died. It was their way of staying in touch with the living. You know, Dorothy replied, we have the northern lights back home, too, in Scotland. We call them Nafir Chlis, the merry dancers. They fell silent again, marveling at the glowing sky. Then Georges took Dorothy's hand. This has all been so rushed, he said, with little more than a whisper. I know, for me too, Dorothy replied. This might sound forward, he went on, but I have missed you. There, I've missed you. I've said it. Do you think you might come again soon? Dorothy leant to him and brushed his ear with her lips. However simple, it was a gesture far more profound than a feathery beast near his cheek. And while her soft answer could not have been shorter, nor could it have meant more, yes. Now, an interesting question lies behind the affair that I have invented for Dorothy and Georges. After first submitting the manuscript to my publisher in 2023, an editor questioned whether something so risque as this outburst of looming extramarital sex was plausible in Victorian times, to which I replied, of course it was. For starters, the rebellion and its aftermath only notionally could be called Victorian, in that Victoria had just come to the throne that same year, 1837. The times, if anything, were still in the afterglow of the rather more liberal Regency period. In any event, what we think of as Victorian, stiff morals, hypocrisy, gloomy Sundays, discreet evenings, discreet coverings around piano legs, all that, dates more from the second half of the century, especially during the Queen's long widowhood. Yet I believe that Victorians in these matters were likely not all that different from people nowadays. They just didn't talk about it all the time, and thank goodness for that. Dorothy is fictional, but Luce Cuvillier, who appears late in the book and some years later, most certainly is real, and most certainly she became George-Étienne Cartier's mistress. Their affair seems to have got underway around 1860, and I think about the only real liberty I've taken with established facts in my book is to imply that it began earlier. By then, Cartier was married, and he and his wife Hortense Fabre were an ill-suited couple. From all reports, she was dour, religious, and, oh, all right, Victorian, while Cartier was outgoing, reveling in the limelight, a very public man. Luce, who was Hortense's older cousin, was altogether different. She never married and was no beauty, as this photograph suggests, but she had wit, style, and a sufficiently sound business sense that she was a kind of behind-the-scenes partner of her well-to-do merchant brother, Maurice. She enjoyed mixing with the movers and shakers of the day. For years, she was deeply involved with the Sisters of Providence, active in helping those nuns operate a shelter in Montreal for destitute, disabled, and elderly women. She smoked cigars and sometimes wore trousers. Victorian, she clearly was not. And to cap it all, she was an adulteress. Georges had long since been effectively separated from Hortense, and in due course he hooked up with Luce. They didn't exactly live together, but they had next-door rural properties at the eastern end of Montreal Island. Their affair was widely known in official circles, but no one, including his political foes, ever used this knowledge against him. Cartier often sought her advice on the issues of the day. She accompanied him frequently to official functions in various places in Canada and abroad. Early in 1867, when Georges was received by Pope Pius IX, Luce went with him to Rome. She, not Hortense, was at his bedside when he died in London in 1873, and in his will, he left her £150 and urged his daughters to follow her advice. In retrospect, I wish I had made more of the relationship because, boy, was she a fascinating person. Let me conclude with a brief digression. My father was a banker, and at the time of his retirement, he was the manager of the important Bank of Montreal branch, formerly the head office of the Molson's Bank in St. James Street, today's Rue Saint-Jacques, the heart of Montreal's historic financial district. By no means was he a religious man, but occasionally he would step out from his office, walk the block or so to Place d'Armes, and slip into Notre Dame Basilica for a few minutes of what? Rest, reflection, it doesn't matter. But one day, recently out of university, I happened to be in Montreal and he took me with him. As we paused in the square, he looked up at the mighty church. He looked over to the Sulpician Seminary beside it, one of the oldest surviving buildings in the city. Look at those stones, my father said. What stories they could tell. In due course, I came to live in Montreal myself, working mainly at the Montreal Gazette. Over the years, I held a variety of jobs, including, for some 17 years, writing the newspaper's regular column on the history of that incomparable city. By then, my father was gone, but I have often reflected on how proud he would have been to know not only that I was solidly entrenched at the Gazette, just half a block along Rue Saint-Jacques from where he had worked, but also that I was telling so many of those stories that he had once imagined. So, thank you for your attention. I do hope that you will search out a copy of the 37, and more important, that you will enjoy, pardon me, that you will enjoy reading it as much as I enjoyed its writing. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, John, for that presentation.